but something you saw as a kid that looked harmless, but if you witnessed it now it would horrify you. Until the age of 12 my grandma had custody of me. I used to sleep with her, and she slept with a baseball bat next to her bed. It wasn't until I was much older that I realized she did it so Dad's friends wouldn't be able to do anything to me. Dad was a drug addict and drunk, and when he was out of prison, he had all kinds of people in and out of the house. You would never know what would be missing the next day off in my Nintendo. She did everything she could to protect me from God knows who or what, and I had zero clue. I was about 8 years old, and I walked into a public bathroom, and I saw two people holding small spoons lumped in the corner. I remember telling my mother afterwards, and she told me they were tired after eating birthday cake. When I was a kid, I would go fishing with my dad quite often in the middle of the woods. One time, we heard what sounded like a woman scream. It spooked me, but not terrified, mostly just confused me. My dad was like, "You know what, I am starving. Let's head home." And we left faster than normal, but he acted normal. Years later, we were reminiscing about all the adventures in the woods, and I mentioned the weird scream, and he said, "Oh, yeah, that was a mountain lion." As soon as I heard the scream, I looked up and saw it looking directly at you from the bank. That's why we got the hell out of Dodge. I had no clue. Edit for clarity, I don't think it was hunting us. I think it saw us as a threat to its territory and gave us a warning to get the hell out. I think if we would have stayed or panicked, it might have attacked. While mountain lions do sometimes attack humans for food, usually children, they're unlikely to waste the energy, especially if the child is with an adult. But if they are going to attack you for food, they obviously aren't going to warn you. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't take their cries seriously. My town swim instructor would always make fun of the boys, anywhere from ages 6 to 13 or so, for wanting to change in the stalls and not out in the main changing room area where he was with his clipboard. He was eventually arrested when a computer tech found child porn on his laptop when he took it in for some repairs, and thanks to the trial we learned that he was filming us with a little camera attached to his clipboard. Also, that he had been molesting a disabled boy that was in his care. When I was about 4 years old I grabbed an Australian brown snake and swung it around like a lasso. The second most venomous land snake. A bite from one of these is a certain death sentence for a child. When I was in 6th grade a girl showed up to school with a Tinkerbell tattoo on her hip. In our child brains, we found this very mature and grown up that her parents had let a family member tattoo her. Looking back at it now, it's concerning that anyone would sign off on a tattoo for a 10 or 11-year-old. Same thing happened at my school. In 6th grade a girl came to school, and while changing for gym she showed off a big tattoo that said "Daddy's little girl" on her barely developed breast. She turned out okay, but you can still see the tattoo in pictures she posted on Facebook and I cringe just thinking about it. A male classmate of mine age 10 bragged about having sex. He seemed to enjoy it. Now I realize he was probably being abused, but back then I just thought he was bragging. We had a swimming pool at our school and had swimming lessons. When we were 8 or 9 years old, my class was getting changed, and as my classmate undressed, she said, "I'm not a virgin, I've had sex," completely unprompted. Our teacher sent her to the head teacher's office, and she got in trouble for lying. She came back to our classroom later that day in complete floods of tears, absolutely inconsolable. At the time I didn't think anything of it, nothing bad had ever happened to me in my life when I was 9. I didn't even have the concept of adults can sexually abuse children. But now I think the fact that she made this statement randomly, unprompted, whilst we were removing our clothes to go swimming, and the fact she was so inconsolable after getting in trouble, points to the fact that something was going on. It breaks my heart that the teachers didn't take it further or try and have it investigated. I told my mum years later she's worked with abused children, and she said this was a definite red flag. My parents told me about me getting drunk at 2 years old when they left a glass of whiskey unattended. I was bumping into walls and falling down. The next day I was extremely pale and sickly looking. My grandmother was begging them to take me to a hospital, but they didn't because they didn't want to get in trouble. I'd always thought of that as a funny story until I told it to a coworker, and she looked horrified and concerned. "Did you have more than a sip?" I can't imagine it tasted nice to a 2 years old, but a bit sip at that size could definitely mess you up. My dad got drunk when he was 7. My grandparents threw a huge party. One guest gave him a sip of creme de menthe, and then he found the champagne-soaked strawberries. Passed out under a table, Grandma put him to bed thinking he was just sacked, and he woke up the next day certain he was dying. A doctor made a house call, because 1950s, diagnosed him with a hangover, and I guess he got Advil in water. Watching my kindergarten teacher die of cancer. He just kept getting skinnier and paler and more exhausted, and eventually he just didn't show up anymore, and that was that. Didn't understand it then, obviously. In my childhood, my neighbor often hired us to help around the garden. When I turned 10, he asked me to come up and help pick the green beans. I went up in some red shorts. While I worked at picking the beans, I happened to glance back at him. I saw this weird jerking motion in his pants. Since I grew up in rural Tennessee in the 70s, I had absolutely no idea what was taking place. I just turned away and continued picking beans. Picking green beans requires a lot of bending over, and I wore very short red shorts. You can figure out what took place, I don't need to spell it out. Teachers flirting with students, car rides home, lunches. Seemed harmless when I was a teen. Now I see how bad that was. Edit, I mean inappropriate rides that are not innocent acts of kindness. Not lunches for kids that need it. I mean flirty, overly friendly relationships that cross boundaries. I went to an all-girls school and we had a lovely, male teacher. We all loved him and he was totally harmless, but I remember needing to be driven to an event later than everyone else, once, and he kept apologizing, but said he just couldn't take me on my own because it wasn't okay. We had to arrange for a second girl to come in the car with us. He also waited for me for my parents to pick me up after an evening event, but obviously felt very anxious about it, whilst wanting me to be okay at the same time. He was a sweetheart, but it must have been so tricky. I've shared this story before, but when I was around 10 years old I was sleeping over at my best friend Juan's house. We usually stayed up really late playing, and would sleep in until like 11 or 12, which I loved, because I rarely got to do that at my house. At about 8 AM his dad comes into the room and tells me to get dressed, because he needed my help. His dad was a big drinker, so either his breath reeked of beer from last night or he had one for breakfast. Either way he was a bit buzzed. He tells me he needs my help picking out a toy for Juan as a surprise, and we were going to drive to Walmart. So we get in the car and drive down to the Walmart, which was like 10 minutes away from his house. It was a pretty awkward ride, and he starts asking me questions to make small talk, like how I was like school, and if I had a girlfriend yet. We get to the Walmart, and he takes me to the toy section, and asks me what I think Juan would like. I walk around, and see Darth Vader's TIE fighter. Juan and I were huge Star Wars fans, and even went to go see Empire Strikes Back in theaters, when it was re-released, so I knew he would like it. He buys the toy, and then we have another awkward car ride back. He thanks me for helping, and asks me to keep it a secret. I changed into my pajamas again, and tried to go back to sleep, but about 10 minutes later his dad comes in, and surprises him with a toy, and gives me a wink. At the time I thought it was such a nice thing for his dad to do for him, but years later I found that the reason we went on this mission to get the toy was because he had been really drunk a couple of nights before and hit Juan, so he wanted to make it up to him. As far as I know that was the only time that ever happened, but it gave a much darker light to what I thought was a wholesome moment. I used to babysit a lot when I was like 12 or 13. I babysat for a family once where the 2-year-old boy's room had a lock on the outside. They told me to lock him in there for half an hour if he misbehaved, which I never did. At the time it seemed a little strange, but obviously now as an adult it seems like a giant red flag. When I was looking to buy a house a while back, my then fiance and I found a house with locks on the outside of all the bedroom doors, and going inside those rooms, we found scratch marks on every single door. We noped the heck out of that house so fast. Growing up in the hood I was always running around exploring, doing dumb crap, not to mention seeing all the carjackings, open drug use, gangbangers, just a bunch of dumb crap really. Anyhow, one day minding my business exploring behind the park, I seen a guy on the ground between 2 mobile homes, creating a sort of alley, and he's just getting absolutely bodied by 2 others. Ended up seeing a knife pulled out, and they just repeatedly stabbed this dying homie over and over. My immature mind didn't fully understand I guess, but I just thought they were playing or thought it wasn't for real. I don't know, I was just very nonchalant and then continued playing and went home. I was young, like 4 maybe, so heck was I supposed to do? I saw a mom and her little daughter get shot in a nice neighborhood cafe across the street when I was shopping for shoes with my mom as a kid. I was old enough to know it was terrible, but it didn't quite sink in until much later. Ex-boyfriend shot them and then himself. When I was 14 I went to my friend's neighbor's apartment because for some reason a 40-year-old woman wanted to be friends with us, and her boyfriend came home and started viciously beating her kids in front of everyone, and she just sat there talking like nothing was wrong, and at the time maybe I was too stunned or just too young to react, but if I saw that now I'd be terrified. In high school, it was extremely common for girls to be dating men in their 20s. So common I thought it was a healthy and normal thing. I even remember a couple girls having meltdowns because they weren't allowed to bring their dates to prom or other school events due to them being 21 or older. The ban was put in place to avoid the risk of booze being provided to minors. Now as a 26-year-old adult, if I found out my 16-year-old cousin was dating a man in his 20s, I'd kill him, the man, not my cousin. A grown-ass man has no business dating a child. I grew up in a northern town with a large homeless population and no homeless shelter. I thought it was perfectly normal to see a homeless person who froze to death on your walk to school in the morning. None of us would even bat an eyelid. A girl in my 5th grade class tried to commit suicide. While class was in session, I watched as I saw her fill her bag with a lot of heavy books, put her head up over her chair, and put the book bag handle around her neck to choke herself. She was removed from class and I didn't see her for months afterwards. When I was in high school, I got off the bus behind a kid I had known since middle school. We were walking to go inside when he just suddenly collapsed in front of me, smacked right into the pavement and started seizing. I knew something was bad wrong, but I thought he would end up being okay. He died in the hospital the next day because of bleeding in his brain. I knew when it happened that it was really messed up that I saw that, but I never realized how disturbing it is until I got older. Now it really makes me upset. I have memories of him from middle school, and he was just such a sweet and kind kid. He died freshman year and they had a moment of silence for him at our graduation. It was very sad. I had a jogger get hit by a car outside my house once when I was about 8 or 9. My nephew came running inside yelling at my parents and my sister to call the ambulance because he was bleeding pretty badly. I could even see him from our playroom's window, and I wondered what he was doing lying on the grass. Turns out he was bleeding out pretty badly, deliriously yelling at my parents when they tried to help. Eventually, an ambulance came and picked him up, but my parents always told me he made it out okay. The day after, in the spot he was found, someone had put a lily in the grass in a vase. It took me longer than I care to admit to figure out he died from the hit and run. One time when I was around 7 or 8, I went to a daytime summer camp. There was a girl I was friends with, and one day I decided to play a prank on her. She was sitting in a chair and I went up behind her, grabbed the back of the chair and shook it. She started laughing and yelling at me to stop. So I stopped. Then she acted surprised and asked why I'd stopped. Well, she specifically requested that's why. And then she said, "No, silly, my dad told me that when a girl says stop, she means you have to do it harder." I meant shake it harder. My own molestation. I hated it, understandably, but I had no idea how serious and disgusting what was happening would have been to a normal adult. On a semi-related subject, parents of Reddit. Do not make your child touch or give affection to others against their will. Grandma will survive Jimmy not wanting to give her a hug. But if Jimmy gets used to being forced to hug and get wet kisses, he may not realize the adult touching his bathing suit parts is doing bad, because it will all just sort of fall into the adults like touching me, and if I try to make them stop, mom's gonna yell at me again. 3. Freaking years. It took me 3 years to actually tell a parent, and in the beginning I told my dad's bass player who asked me for a hug, then told me I didn't have to hug if I didn't want to. Apparently, I very matter-of-factly told him okay, but don't put your fingers up my cookie. When he realized what I meant, he went paper white and ran to get my dad from the other room, and they started asking what the hell I was talking about. Then I had to tell my mom, which, repeating this stuff 3 times was a pain. Not to mention all the times I had to tell a cop. My story never changed, but he was never prosecuted because an 8-year-old wasn't a reliable witness. This makes me wonder if he had friends on the force or something, because that was bull. For extra fun, my mom exclaimed, "Yes, you have to hug grandma." Other relatives I disliked, "But you aren't supposed to let people touch you there." She didn't mean to, but I took that as it's my fault. I did something to cause this. Deep down, it probably wasn't my fault, but between that and my dad saying I had a victim attitude, I was messed in the head at a young age. Bonus story. My grandmother at a family reunion told everyone I had been molested and must have led them on, since nice little girls don't make men do that sort of thing. Growing up, there was a super friendly late 20-something guy living in the house next door with his girlfriend or wife and her parents. He used to always shoot hoops with me and my buddies in the neighborhood. My friends and I were all about 10-12 at the time. This guy was a Marine Corps veteran, and one day he let us all check out and hold his arsenal of weapons. There were handguns, a rifle, some other kind of automatic weapon I don't remember now, and a grenade. I distinctly remember being surprised how heavy the handgun was. This was mid-90s. I was around 9 or 10 when I was walking down the sidewalk past a senior living high-rise. An old woman was laying on the ground reaching out trying to say something, but her speech was all slurred. I didn't understand and just thought she was laying in the grass mumbling and kept walking, but I mean she was clearly in need of medical attention. We used to jump off our roof. First time hurt a little, but after a few times you learned how to land. Did it regularly and would try various items as parachutes to see if it slows you down any. I look at that height now and wonder how the hell we never broke anything. Kids' bones are more elastic, I guess. My mom did this as a kid. She was always getting into stuff she shouldn't have been, so ended up hurting herself quite badly a few times and trying to hide it. She was jumping off the roof with her cousins and using a towel as a parachute. Unfortunately, she got a little too close to the building and a nail end sticking out got her on the way down. I'm not sure how far into herself she ripped in the bum from memory, but this was in a time when you didn't go to the hospital for anything. Rural America, people who had grown up in the Depression with no jobs or affordable healthcare. When I, a woman, was like 8 or 9, I used to spend time with my grandma on weekends and she loved going to garage sales. I remember going to this one garage sale where my grandma bumped into someone she knew and they were chatting it up. She was distracted and not paying attention to me. The man holding the garage sale must have been in his 50s or so. He had a lot of hunting gear for sale and I found a neat old duck whistle. I was playing around with it when the guy noticed and thought he would teach me how to use it. Apparently I wasn't blowing into it properly. He started explaining how to breathe and whatever and how to blow into it, but each time I did, he was like, no, you have it all wrong. So, to better teach me, he came around and stood behind me. He had his hands on my flanks and was explaining how to take a deep breath and exhale or blow into the whistle. He stood there, explaining this to me for several minutes, and each time I tried to use the duck whistle, I could feel him getting closer until he was almost like grinding on me. At the time as a kid, I just thought he had no sense of personal space. Now as an adult, I realize what a freaking creep he was.